Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Today's presentation is about warmth in the first half of the 20th century. We see two very different graphs here. The one on the left was from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1974. It showed no net warming from 1870 to 1970. There was a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940, followed by a lot of cooling, and all of the prior warmth and warming was lost. This is very different from the current NASA graph, which shows almost steady warming from 1880 to the present. So which graph was real? In 1923, glaciers were disappearing. Arctic had warmed radically with unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Glaciers were disappearing. In 1939, it was reported that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting, and like the glaciers of Norway, they faced the possibility of catastrophic collapse. In 1947, it was reported by scientists that both poles were melting so rapidly that the lowlands faced the possibility of being inundated with water. Dr. Ullman, who was the leading Arctic authority at the time, reported that the temperature in the Arctic had increased by 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the year 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific viewpoint. So what about the cooling after 1940? In 1960, the New York Times reported unanimous agreement among scientists that the Earth was getting colder. And in 1963, the Canberra Times reported that glaciers were growing in Norway for the first time in 200 years. So clearly the climate had cooled dramatically. Remember, in the 1940s, glaciers were melting very rapidly and scientists were worried about sea level rise. And by 1963, everybody was saying that it was cooling and that glaciers were growing again. So what happened? Well, if we go back to NASA's graph from 1981, we see something very different from their current graph in red. This gray line is 1981. It was warm in the 1940s. And what they've done is NASA's gone and changed their data and cooled the past quite a bit. So whose graphs make sense? This graph is from the National Academy of Sciences in 1975. It showed a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940, followed by a lot of cooling in 1970. And this graph makes sense. Glaciers were melting in 1923 when it was warm, and they were growing in 1963 when temperatures were cold. If we apply the same historical data to the NASA graph, it doesn't make any sense. They show glaciers melting in 1923 when it's cold, and glaciers growing in 1963 when it's warm. So clearly the alterations that NASA's made to their own graphs are incorrect. These changes didn't happen accidentally. The graph on the left is a Department of Energy report from 1985 with data from Phil Jones showing warming in 1940 followed by the global cooling. And if we look at this ClimateGate email on the right, addressed to the same Phil Jones from Tom Wigley at NCAR, he said if we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees centigrade, this would be significant for the global mean, but we'd still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So basically what scientists did was they made a decision that they wanted to get rid of the 1940s warmth. They didn't have any justification for it, and they were looking for ways to do it. This is not how we do science, and this is junk science. It's not real science. Real science, scientists look at the data and they form the theory around it. In climate science, what they typically do is they have a theory and they alter the data to match their theory. Remember to visit Toto at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a very long time. Thanks for joining me.